Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. It's been called the New World Disorder, a global landscape in which many of the usual reference points are suddenly a lot harder to find when they haven't disappeared altogether. Now, as Barack Obama looks ahead to a second term as U.S. president, he may at times feel as if that familiar foreign policy rug has been just pulled out from under his feet. Now, my guest today has spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the changing world order and its strategic implications for major powers, especially the United States. Welcome to the studios, Alexander Lenin.
Thanks.
You are a senior fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based Center for International and Strategic Studies, where you specialize in international security issues. You're also editor-in-chief of the Washington Quarterly. That's the flagship journal of the center. You previously worked at the U.S. State Department focusing on the Middle East.
That's right.
That's a lot of resume. Let's start with the Middle East, actually.
Sounds good.
It's interesting. You were in Paris early 2011, March 2011, and at the time you were talking about what we were calling the new global security order, and the Arab Spring was in full swing at the time. And you were talking about how everything is sort of changing and in flux, and that seems more true now than ever before. And there's a lot of uncertainty. I have the sense the U.S. is really off balance right now, and it looks at that part of the world.
Yeah, I think there's a sense of rebalancing or a sense of priorities that are emerging with the administration. I mean, you certainly have non-proliferation issues that have been a priority for decades. It's not just something as after the Cold War. You certainly have others, some of which we've made a lot of progress on. Others, like climate change, we know we need to make progress on and haven't done as much. But I think certainly that history is that in the second term of an administration, they tend to have even more focus on foreign policy, particularly as they get toward the end, and they sort of have their bearings under them. So we'll see. I expect that to be the same in this administration.
What about, though, the forces themselves that we now see ascendant in the Middle East, the Islamist parties that came to power? In some cases, the U.S. belatedly came to their side, supported the people in the street. There's a sense of uneasiness, isn't there, in Washington right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discomfort with moderate Islamist parties in politics. But I think there's also, especially among the foreign policy experts, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of advice going to the government that they need to reach out to those politics, that the best way to move people away from violence as a means of getting political goals is to integrate them into the political process. And I think in the second term of a U.S. administration, when they are not up for re-election, their ability to withstand some of the criticism from more conservative circles that would resist that sort of placement is much more likely.
So there's more of an incentive perhaps now, or the political ability for Barack Obama to reach out more to these groups and to try to work with them.
Yeah, part of it is just as time goes on, people get more comfortable with their positions, and part of it is the politics, is that they don't have to worry about the criticism as much when they're not up for re-election. That's right.
I definitely want to talk about Iran. I'm going to get there in a second. I just want to ask you about Mohammed Morsi. What is your take right now on what's going on over there? And especially, what's your sense of how the U.S., what they're feeling, when Obama gets together with his advisors in the White House? Do they see him as a dictator, or do they basically trust the guy?
I couldn't tell you from within the administration what they see with them. I can tell you that from the beginning of this administration, there was a sense that when you approach democratic movements, the more out front and the more public the United States is, the more counterproductive it is for those democratic movements to emerge indigenously. I think you saw that throughout a lot of the Arab awakenings, the Arab Spring, the Islamist awakenings, whatever you want to call the movement that's going on. But that as the public in the Middle East and in those countries takes control over their countries more than they were in the past, it's up to them to decide the exact parameters of politics, how they go about doing that. And there's much less, not only for the United States to be able to do because of its resources, but that it should do because it doesn't ultimately end up in a more stable environment in those areas. Egypt is one particular case because of the U.S. relations with the Egyptian military, that it was able to influence, especially in the Tahrir Square, keep things a little bit more stable. That's
over a billion. I just want to note for our viewers, what is it, $1.5 billion of U.S. aid a year to the Egyptian military?
Yeah, because as an outgrowth of the Camp David Accord, or sort of a history from the Camp David Accord, has been in place since the late 1970s. It's a well-established relationship. And so there is a bit more influence in Egypt and the Egyptian military and the role that they have, but the exact constitutional process in politics is one that's going to continue for quite some time.
Do you see then a sense of waning? It sounds like waning U.S. influence in the region, or let me just say a looser U.S. grip on the ability to influence events there?
Part of it depends on what you're comparing it to. Certainly compared to the Cold War, when you don't have a U.S.-Soviet competition and every country in the world sort of chooses one side or the other for the most part, there's less influence in that way. That's certainly true. Resources are more of a constraint in the United States. The budgetary problems, the economic problems, that's undoubtedly also true. But there is also a bit of a strategic decision, is that the more public the influence tries to be, the more counterproductive that can be sometimes. So it's all three levels.
The 900-pound gorilla in the Middle East policy room right now, the Iranian nuclear issue.
Yeah.
We are right now at a stage, I've gotten the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Obama administration has been in favor of a diplomatic approach, but feeling a lot of heat perhaps from the Israeli side, that time's limited.
Yeah. I mean, for Israel, an Iranian nuclear weapon is an existential crisis. I mean, it's a bit different than the United States, both because of the distance and because of the hostility between Iran and Israel. So they are certainly going to have a different perspective on the issue. I don't think either side wants to go or have some sort of war. I think the administration would certainly prefer a negotiated solution. I think two things are different now than in 2009 when the administration first came into office seeking some sort of negotiated agreement with Iran. First is the sense of who calls the shots in Iran is much different. At the time in 2009, there was a sense to work with Ahmadinejad, that they would wait until after the Iranian election. There were a couple of letters that were sent. There was
we remember the famous letter that
Exactly.
Barack Obama wrote, that outreach letter.
Yeah. There was the New Year's message that went in March.
Yeah.
But then, of course, after the June election, with the Green Movement arising, the engagement track went nowhere. Now I think it's much more about Ayatollah Khamenei and working with him.
The supreme leader.
The supreme leader, exactly. The second difference, I think, now is there is much more skepticism that Iran could say yes to a deal. There is a lot of sense throughout Washington that Iran basically needs the hostility with the United States to help keep the regime in power, to help keep the Islamic regime in power.
They need an enemy.
They need an enemy, and they need an ideological foe in order to keep it in
great
place.
Satan.
That doesn't mean they're not going to try. It doesn't mean they are not going to reach out. I think there is an outline of a bargain that might be able to be reached in the first 6 months of the year or so. But the real question may very well be whether Iran can say yes to a negotiating process.
I can't talk about the Iran issue without bringing Israel into this discussion a little bit. We are obviously looking ahead in a few weeks to elections in Israel, and a lot of the expectations are that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be reelected as Prime Minister, yet perhaps with a lurch to the right, with an even more right-wing government. How will that affect the Iranian calculus here?
Yeah. How it affects Iran's calculus is uncertain. How it affects the negotiating timing going forward is a little bit more clear. The Israeli elections, are in January, and the United States in the end of November has already made statements that unless Iran comes into compliance with its obligations, that by March the United States would seek for the issue to be referred to the UN Security Council again. Now, what happens in the UN Security Council depends. It could be another round of sanctions that we place on Iran, which have been particularly effective. We saw the rial, for a number of reasons, including the sanctions, sort of take a serious dive over the course of the summer and cause major economic problems within Iran. It could also mean military action, although I wouldn't expect the UN Security Council would approve of that, but that could be some alternative that would be brought to the table. But I certainly think that Israel made a very clear statement with Netanyahu's address to the UN General Assembly in September.
With that bomb drawing.
Not only with the bomb drawing, but also with the timeline. He said, we basically have until spring or the summer. If Iran were to have enough medium-enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon in a secret laboratory someplace that we don't have the intelligence to know where it might be, that's a real existential threat to Israel. And they have not reached that point yet. But Israel basically said, as of September, 6 to 9 months or so. That means late spring, early summer.
How would you characterize right now? I know you're not an administration insider, but you're in Washington. You hear the thinking going on. How would you characterize the U.S. relationship with Israel? How much personal and just political antagonism is there between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of sort of, gossip and soap operas about this. It certainly seemed that Netanyahu wanted Romney to win the U.S. election and then kind of backed off from that. More than anything else, and there's actually been a couple of authors that have written about this, the personal animosity is more a reflection of a little bit of a distancing between the United States and Israel. Some of the differences in how it approaches other issues in the region, but not in any way that the United States would criticize Israel publicly, not in any way it doesn't understand what's going on, but in a different strategic approach to how Israel may or may not serve its best interests.
You don't see that basic access, that solid alliance between the U.S. and Israel, which we saw in the recent Palestinian vote at the UN, U.S. being one of 9 countries to vote against it.
Yeah,
that's not going to change.
No, I don't think that the solidity of the alliance is firm. The question is more of a strategic difference of opinion between the two that leads to a little bit of what sometimes seems like sort of public bickering.
This is very unfair because we only have less than 2 minutes left, and I want to shift it to China briefly. Just maybe the most important rising story in the world. Exactly. I know you've dedicated a lot of time to China. Briefly, if you can. Yeah. How do you see China and its rise more as a confrontation issue for the United States or an opportunity for cooperation?
The key is how China sees its role in the world going forward. What I mean by that is that China has a number of issues in its global approach that over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, it has begun to look at the demands of global governance or the global system as a drain on its economy and on its economic development. The first thing we see when we see China is the second or possibly the largest economy in the world. The first thing Chinese see when they see China is an economy that has a per capita income that's somewhere in the 60s in the world. It's a totally different approach, which means a big difference.
So the Chinese don't see themselves as much of a superpower threat as we see the Chinese. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the United States or Western Europe.
Exactly. I mean, Chinese is obviously, there's a lot of different factions, even more so than there are in many other countries for the most part. But certainly if you talk to economists in China, their principal prism through which they see the Chinese economy is per capita. We see it in aggregate terms.
So
that's
it's
a totally
as a developing
different view.
country still with a long way to go.
Right. And what that means is the demands that the world can place on China are different. If you look at your per capita income, you think you don't have a lot to afford to be able to contribute. If you see an aggregate economy, you see somebody that should be stepping up to the table and do more for the rest of the world: stability, prosperity, and justice.
And the new leader, of course, I remind our viewers, Xi Jinping, he has his work cut out, just elected. He has a decade in power, so he's going to be the man at the helm overseeing all this. Alexander Lenin, we're going to have to leave it there. Senior Fellow, Center for International Strategic Studies in Washington, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Quarterly. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today on the new global order or disorder, as you want to have it. And thanks to all of you for watching. You can follow France 24 on its website, www.france24.com. You could also follow me, if you want to, on Twitter, @DougF24. Thanks again for watching.